What is the relationship between Santa Claus and the federal government? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that important question. Of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, Christmas week. The show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who apparently has all his papers graded from last week, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again, and Merry Christmas.
Yes, free at last. Praise the Lord, free at last. I've graded all the exam papers, and the students were pretty happy. Very good grades for the most part. But now I'm free, like my students, for until almost the middle of January, which is a delight.
Yeah, it is a delight. You professors live a cush life. You get these long Christmas vacations. You get 3 months off of paid vacation during the summer. You teach, I don't know, a couple of classes each week. It's a nice life, Richard. It's almost as good as being.
It's amazing. I even wake up. For the viewers and listeners who are being misinformed by these remarks by you know who here, the fact is that it sounds like an easy life, but the fact there is a lot of class preparation, research writing, PowerPoints, advising students, meeting with students, grading exams frequently during the semester. And then when it is downtime, like the holiday or the summer, that's when some of us actually do serious writing to be at the cutting edge of all those important free market ideas. Thank you.
Playing the violin.
I appreciate the violin. Matter of fact, the tune was great. Could you do the little bit more fiddling?
All right, Richard, let's get down to serious business here.
I was serious.
This is Christmas time. And many years ago, I think probably about 9 or 10 years ago, you wrote an article for FFF called "Yes, Virginia, There Is No Santa Claus." And you talked about the federal government as Santa Claus. And it's really, I think we need to revisit this, maybe revisit it every Christmas time here on Libertarian Angle, make it a tradition, but especially now that Congress is enacting this almost $2 trillion bill here at Christmas time, behaving as our Santa Claus. And so why don't you talk to us about what that article was all about and why you feel it's relevant to Christmas time today?
Well, the relevancy comes from the fact that we are currently in a political environment, unrestrained democratic politics, in which politicians make their living, by which I mean being elected and reelected, and having their hands on the levers of power and the spending spigot, by promising people other people's money. You want unemployment insurance, you want Social Security, you want medical care, you want subsidized or free housing, you want an education for your child, you want a farm support if you're in agriculture, or you're in the defense munitions industry. Well, have I got a defense bill for you? Because look at all of the threats around the world. So we have to keep those planes and tanks and uniforms and boots and et cetera flowing from your factories. But all of this is couched in a rhetoric that it's as if it's manna from heaven falling. It's like Santa Claus, government Santa Claus, is somehow in some place with his other little elves, and they're making all of these things and giving them to you in the form of money to spend in various and sundry ways, either discretionary by you as a recipient, or targeted as a benefit, an in-kind benefit. But the fact is that there are no free lunches. There is no North Pole with little government elves making all of these things as if there's no expense for anyone. Everything that the government spends has to come from one and one source only: other people's money. in one of two ways. Either the government taxes us and then takes on net more money from Peter to give a net benefit to Paul, or the government has to borrow the money. And if it borrows the money, it on the one hand crowds out private borrowers who otherwise might have borrowed other people's savings, or it has to then run a budget deficit and have the Federal Reserve indirectly in various ways fund that borrowing by printing money. And as we're now experiencing with the return to noticeable consumer price index price inflation, every month as the prices rise, that's the depreciation of the remaining dollars in your pocket. In other words, it's an indirect form of taxation through the loss of value to all of the money that you've either saved or that you're earning out of your regular paycheck. So there are no free lunches. It is an illusion. And it's captured particularly at this time of the year when, as you were saying, Congress is passing an almost $2 trillion spending bill to get through this part of this coming year. And what does it talk about when you read the opinion pages? Well, we need more of this and we need more of that. And it's about time the government spent more here and there. But they never explain where the tax revenues are to come from, or the borrowed money to come from in terms of other things not funded through borrowing, for all of these dollars to be spent. It is all an illusion. It's the belief that Santa Claus is going to come down the chimney, the political chimney, and leave all the goodies under the Christmas tree as if they're just produced by magic with no cost of real resources, real capital, real labor efforts that otherwise could have been devoted to people using their own money, spending it in their own ways, with resources being devoted to the production of that which people demonstrate they want by their demands in the marketplace. It is a fairy tale that has no reality to it. And as long as the people buy into this, and the politicians and the media and the special interest pundits have an unending stream of rationales to keep it going, this system, unfortunately, will continue this way until it finally reaches an inescapable point of bankruptcy. As Margaret Thatcher once said, the welfare state is quite viable until you run out of other people's money.
That's a great point. Well, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about those stimulus checks that may have started out around Christmas time a couple of years ago. I'm not really sure, but in any event, the mindset was the same. We are giving you free money. Look how good the federal government is. Oh yeah, we're shutting down your businesses. We're cratering your sources of income, but we are going to send you free money. And I remember, Richard, there were those of us at the Libertarian Educational Foundations and think tanks saying, well, especially at FFF, saying, this ain't free. We're going to end up paying the price for this. But, no, it's like, oh, no, Jacob, this is free money. This is free money. Well, when people saw the prices of gasoline soaring at the tank and when they were filling up their vehicles or going to the grocery store and paying exorbitant prices or trying to buy a used car, that's when they realized, those stimulus checks from 2 or 3 years ago weren't free after all. They were just printing the money to give everybody their free gift. And your point about borrowing is so good. I mean, imagine parents that, let's say they got 3 kids and they want to give their kids a really nice Christmas every year. So they go to the bank and they borrow $100,000, and man, they buy the best presents ever. And then the next year they go and borrow another $100,000, pay the interest off, and by the time their kids are 18, they're in debt to the tune of about $1 million or $2 million, and they're looking like, oh my God, how are we going to pay this debt? What's going on here? Well, that's what happens when you're putting everything in hock to live beyond what you're bringing in income. And that's exactly what the government's been doing. It's been running up this credit card. Unfortunately, the credit card is drawn on all of us because, as you point out, the government has one source of income, and that's the money it seizes through taxation or borrows in the private sector from the private sector. And so they're now at $31 trillion in debt, and yet they're spending even more money. And let me give you my thesis here, though, Richard, on this whole welfare state stuff. I have long held that what's really going on here is not the welfare state; it's the warfare state. The Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. This is all about them. It's essentially a giant military welfare program. All these foreign wars and invasions and coups, where they're ginning up the crises and they're ginning up the enemies, and they're making life dangerous and precarious to justify their own existence. But they're the ones in charge, and I'm not the only one who says this. Michael Glennon, whose book I've long recommended, called National Security and Double Government. He's a professor of law at Tufts University. He served as counsel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So this guy knows what he's talking about. His thesis is the national security establishment is in charge of the government. They're the ones that are really running the show, especially in foreign affairs. But they permit the other three branches, the judiciary, the Congress, and the president, to have the veneer that they're in power. They don't care about the appearance. What matters is they're in charge. The welfare state, I hold, is simply a way to keep people pacified, to keep them quiet and silent, not to oppose the warfare state side of this. So you've got people on Social Security and Medicare and farm subsidies and all the things you mentioned, the education grants and so forth. They're not going to make waves in a fundamental sense because the government could terminate that dole whenever it wanted to. I mean, once you go on the dole, you become submissive, you become compliant, you defer to authority because you don't want to risk losing your dole. So it's sort of like you've got a giant opium den of people that are dependent on the dole that don't have the intestinal fortitude, the will to challenge this massive military machine that I think has taken our country down from within. And another example of this is not just all the foreign escapades, one of which is in Ukraine, where they're bringing Paris close to nuclear war, all the domestic military bases. What are they for, Richard? I mean, who's going to invade the United States anytime soon? Russia? They can't even invade Ukraine. China? Come on. There is no risk of an invasion of the United States. Somebody loves you, Richard. And so here we have the massive welfare warfare state. I'm going to wrap up my pitch on that.
Let me sort of amplify something. I don't know how many of our quote older viewers and listeners will remember the name Felix Morley. He was a well-known old-right conservative / classical liberal. He wrote some excellent books on these themes, on freedom and federalism, power in the people. But when the conservative quarterly Modern Age first came out, I believe it was in 1958, he had the lead article in the first issue. And the title of that article is American Republic or American Empire. And the theme of that in 1958 was the idea is that Keynesianism had become a popular policy tool to win the support of vested and special interests. But what it also was particularly successful in keeping the spending pump going was to connect it with the emergent American empire in the post-World War II period. That you would always justify the deficits and the government spending out of the concerns about national security, an enemy abroad that has to be opposed, and for which all sacrifices have to be made with those tax dollars, and most especially deficit spending, with the appearance as if we can do all of these things with no immediate burden on them. And that as long as the system is ultimately bolstered by the rationale and the existence of American empire, it will be very difficult to return to the American Republic. And if I can add one other thing here, and that is when we're talking about borrowed money, what it is, it's the current generation borrowing part of the available savings and the real resources that savings represents on their own current desires for government spending on this, that, and the other. with the presumption that in principle, both the principal and the promised interest is to be paid back on the future, not just a month from now, years from now, but decades from now. So it is basically an intergenerational redistribution of wealth from using today's resources without the current generation paying for those resources through the government borrowing technique and placing the financial promise to pay it back, principal and interest, on a future generation. The analogy I sometimes use to explain this to my students, Jacob, is that imagine that if your parents, you've left home, you're on your own, and your parents decide to go on a wild binge. They're just going to go crazy. They're going to go on cruises around the world. They're going to go to the best restaurants. They're going to buy the nicest clothes. And so the bottom line is by the time they pass away, they not only have spent all of their own personal savings, but they have maxed out all of their credit cards to the tune of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then when they pass away, they, in their will, say that you now, we are giving you all of our assets and our liabilities to pay back. So you, our children, will now have the pleasure of knowing that what we've left you as an inheritance are all of our credit bills to pay off. Now, well, would you feel that your parents had shown for thoughtfulness or concern or consideration for you, their own children, if they burden you with their debts for a good part of the remainder of your life because they wanted to have a good time before they passed away? That is what is going on now with the military spending, with the domestic welfare state. It is the use of today's resources by today's generation with a large part, if not the vast majority of the part of the burden to pay that back in some way, shape, or form, which can include future inflation, not just taxes to pay it off, on the next generation. Because when Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, as the Democratic heads of the two branches of Congress, go about spending all of this money, are they concerned? Nancy Pelosi is going to retire. Schumer is getting old. They will have gotten all of those votes and all that support and gained all these goodies to those who gave them those votes, and they'll be dead long before the full bill comes due. That's the immorality of this. That is a core immorality. A theme that I should point out, this intergenerational plundering was emphasized particularly by the Nobel Prize free market economist James Buchanan.
Yeah, those are excellent points. But the question naturally arises is, can this system go out of existence? I mean, when you've got so many people on the dole, what are the chances that we can prevail in putting this ship back on the right course here? Because, we can't know the timing for when this thing's going to end badly, but we can certainly know that it's going to end badly at some point. This is an unsustainable system. And take the military side of this, Richard. I mentioned all the military bases across the country. How many communities and cities are willing to see their bases closed in order to get America back on the right road toward a limited government republic instead of a military empire? I would venture to say not very many. They go into panic mode. Oh my gosh, the city will fall into the ocean or the river or would disappear without our military largesse. And how many Social Security recipients are willing to acknowledge what you just said, that this is an intergenerational mandatory transfer program. It's leaving young people in much worse shape, and it's an unsustainable system. I mean, as each year goes by, they're having to plunder and loot young people to an even greater extent. And I hear young people saying, "Oh, well, Social Security is not going to be there when I get there, when I get that old," like they're lamenting. Well, of course it will. All they have to do is just plunder and loot their children and their children's generation. They might have to tax them 60% of their income, 70% of their income, but so what? They've got a right to retire, and those children and grandchildren, well, that's just tough luck. They're going to have to deal with the fact that they can only keep 30% of their income. Well, what we really need, Richard, is a moral revival in this country that sees what you just said, that the moral repugnancy of this entire system it's a socialist system. It's taking money from people who have it in order to give it to people who the government says need it more. And what we need is a moral revival that acknowledges that socialism has proven to be the bane of mankind, and where people rise to the occasion and say, you know what? We're going to change this system back to the sound founding principles of America. Now, we know there were some bad founding principles, slavery, women's rights, and so forth, but there were some good founding principles. One of them which was no mandatory welfare, no Social Security, no Medicare, no education grants, farm subsidies. For more than 100 years, that was our system. That's our heritage. Charity was voluntary. There was no taxation on income. People kept everything they earned and decided what to do with it. This is how the hospitals got built, the museums, the opera houses, the libraries, all voluntary. Because when people were free to accumulate wealth, that many of them did good things with that wealth by voluntarily helping out others. And no immigration controls, no big military intelligence establishment, no CIA, no NSA, no Pentagon. There was just a basic military force. This is what it once meant to be free in America. This is what it once meant to be an American. Money, gold coins and silver coins, instead of this irredeemable paper money that they have devalued year after year and decade after decade, plundering and looting people in the process. And so we've painted this picture of here at FFF of what we need to do to get this country back on the right road to liberty, peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world. The question is, are enough people ready to say, you know what, let's restore those principles and let's dismantle this immoral and destructive welfare warfare state?
Well, let me just sort of say that, the question is how long can this go on and what brings it to an end? Eventually, as Thatcher emphasized, you do run out of other people's money in one way, shape, or form. But let's suppose that is hypothetically possible to stop this and reverse it before you reach that abyss, or even now when you're at the edge of the abyss and have to figure out what to do. That's why it is important to emphasize the power of ideas. At some point, in some situation, at some step of this process, we will reach a fork in the road. That is the country, the people, the nation. We will have to decide, well, what has caused this crisis situation? What is to be done about it? And how do we proceed? That is, what political, ideological, economic policy direction do we move to escape from this either coming or experienced disaster? Now, at that time, at that crossroads, it will matter a lot which ideas have become widely accepted and understood at one level or another by a large segment of the population. Will it be presumed, well, you see, this just demonstrates we need even more government control, more government management, more government planning? You see, it's not that it failed. We just didn't move further in the collectivist, paternalistic governmental direction. Or are there enough people who have heard our kind of message and see the cogency and importance of it, who say, no, it is the direction that we've been moving in under collectivism and political paternalism and the presumption of interventionism, welfare statism, government planning that has gotten to this point, us to this point of ruin. And we must now rethink and reverse the steps we've taken to follow that earlier path upon which the country was founded. Individual liberty, free markets, freedom of voluntary association, limited government, secure civil liberties, a non-interventionist conception of the political regime, both at home and abroad. That will determine the longer-term fate of the country. That's why we are in a war, a crusade, a battle over ideas. It often can seem saddening or melancholy to think, how can we ever return? But you never know when there can be a change in the current and the trend of ideas. It's happened in the past, and it can happen again in the future. And now, if I can sort of add to that, since we are approaching the end of the year, I want to say on behalf of my dear friend, my dear colleague in this battle for freedom, Jacob Hornberger, that in doing so, there is no better place, if you care about these ideas, than to think about your end-of-year giving to support the Future Freedom Foundation. For over 3 decades, Jacob Hornberger, and in my own modest way, have attempted to assist in fighting for these ideas. These are the ideas upon which the country was founded. These are the ideas upon which the country was made great, in the most complimentary and appropriate way of talking about America great. And it's the ideas that can make America sound, free, and prosperous once again. But it needs your help. It needs your help to enable this fight to go on, to stop the direction we're moving in, and to return us to a land of liberty.
Well, thank you, Richard. I greatly appreciate that. And yeah, this is our end of year fundraising time. If you haven't yet made your end of year donation to FFF, we greatly appreciate your help. Most of the money that we receive gets us through the following year. Of course, we still rely on donations during the course of the year, but we could sure use your support. You've kept us going for 33 years now, and Richard was there at the beginning when I first started FFF back in 1989. And Richard, the point you make is so good about understanding freedom and trying to raise people's vision to what freedom really is, because a classic example of this was the Great Depression. People were led to believe that this was the failure of free enterprise. They didn't have an understanding of what real economic liberty was all about. And so it was really caused by the central bank, the Federal Reserve, but people didn't understand that.
Mhm.
If people had understood that, they wouldn't have gone through the whole New Deal experience, the welfare state revolution. They would have said, you idiots, why'd you bring the central bank into existence in the first place? Get rid of it so we don't have to go through this again. Instead, they bought into this notion that, oh yeah, failure of free enterprise. There's still people that believe that to this day. Even though Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, when he was chairman, even acknowledged to Milton Friedman, you were right about the Great Depression being caused by the Federal Reserve. And Richard, the deeper one's understanding is of the principles of liberty, the greater faith people have in liberty. You know, people sometimes say, oh, Jacob, you would abolish Social Security. There'd be people dying in the streets and Medicare dying of illnesses overnight. This is ridiculous, because once you understand how freedom works, you have a tremendous faith in freedom. And we need to recapture that faith, a faith in freedom, a faith in ourselves, a faith in others, and for many of us, a faith in God instead of a faith in the coercive apparatus of Caesar. There's no care and compassion in these mandatory charity programs. None. The IRS is not the embodiment of care and compassion. It's a tyrannical, scary organization. And I think as more people recapture that faith, the genuine faith in themselves, others, freedom, God, and so forth, then they're willing to say, you know, Jacob, you're right. You can get rid of these programs today, and we should, and everybody would be fine. Some people might have to go back to work if they're seniors, but people that really need help, there's church groups, there's neighborhood groups, there's children, there's families. And a classic example of this was slavery, Richard. There were people saying, undoubtedly saying, I don't know exactly that they were saying this, but undoubtedly they were saying, oh, it would be inhumane to cut off slaves immediately, to terminate slavery just by pushing the button. That would be horrible. They don't have job training. They don't know how to get a work ethic. We need to phase out slavery over a long period of time. Undoubtedly, there were people saying that. And yet, on the day the Civil War ends, slaves are free. And that was what they wanted. They wanted lives where they weren't being taken care of and having guaranteed jobs and guaranteed food and guaranteed this and guaranteed that. They wanted the opportunity, the freedom to manage their own lives and take care of themselves. And in fact, they did very well, much better than when they were slaves, because that's what freedom does. And that's what we do here at FFF. We try to increase people's understanding of freedom, because with that understanding comes the faith in freedom.
And that's why it is so important for you to assist the Future of Freedom Foundation.
All right, on that fine note, we'll wrap things up again. This is our end of year fundraising time. I hope you'll help us out and help us to advance liberty in the year ahead. Merry Christmas to everybody. And Richard, Merry Christmas to you. Greatly enjoyed the show as always, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Happy holidays, everyone, until we see each other again.